Good morning, friends. Welcome to the series of lectures that we are organizing, and the series is called World Literature. And in this series, we have had already a few lectures covering the general areas of theory and ideology, and that will help us understand the texts and literary trends that we will be pursuing later. And in this series today, the topic of the discussion would be on literary trends in the 20th century, and already as you would know, certain trends have been covered. And for today's lecture, we have Dr. Payal Nagpal, the expert from Janaki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University. She teaches in the English department there, and she is a known scholar. She has worked on literary theory, modern drama, and she is also a theatre person, and published many books as well, along with articles, attending conferences and all that. So, our expert today will be telling us about the literary trends in 20th century. And I now welcome Dr. Payal Nagpal to give the lecture, please.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Today's lecture, as mentioned, is going to be about the literary trends in the 20th century. First of all, we need to ask what is the need to discuss literary trends of the 20th century. When we study them in the context of world literature, it's important to understand certain movements, certain literary trends that happened across the globe that influenced literature in the different countries. And in a discussion of world literature, it becomes important to ask then that, how is it that these diverse countries, different languages and literatures in those languages, how do we have a pool that we have a kind of blanket term that we call world literature, which means that we are looking at representative texts and trends in those representative texts from the different countries. So, when we do that, it is also important to ask what are these literary trends that actually shaped in some way the kind of literature that was being produced in the different countries. So, what were the movements in a sense in the 20th century that led to this, to a development, a further development of this idea of the Weltanschauung or the world literature? So, to begin with, we will look at a movement that happens just at the turn of the century, a movement that is called modernism. In fact, if we look at the 20th century, there are a lot of these isms that we have. So, we have modernism, we have formalism, we have socialism, we have existentialism, we have in art and various trends from symbolism in art, we have surrealism, there are these other movements like Dadaism, Cubism and so on. So, when we study these, especially at the turn of the century, what is it that actually leads to this kind of change? So, when we look at modernism, for instance, we are looking at a movement that has a very important word there, which is called modern. So, which means that it represents a kind of break from what was already there. So, how do we arrive at this understanding? Because these are not things that kind of happen overnight. This is something that evolves out of the context of the 19th century. So, if we look at some absolutely cutting edge and theories, things that actually totally change the way in which thought processes worked. So, we have of course the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, and we have The Evolution of Species by Charles Darwin. So, of course, there are these other trends that lead to the development of these ideas, but they totally changed the way in which man, as in the human being, perceived his or her relationship with his the immediate world, the environment, so to say. So, it promoted in a sense a kind of scientific outlook. So, a very cohesive sort of understanding of the individual with the immediate environment, with the world, or the way the individual looked at his or her life, that changed. And this jump from a kind of cohesive order where everything was stratified and human beings understood the rationale for their being in this world. So, from there to a world where the individual was a kind of lone entity who is now to understand and create a rationale for being there. So, because now he was subject to not any other theory, but the idea of evolution. So, this of course pans out very well if you look at France. It's somewhere from 1890 till about the mid 20th century. In Russia also it begins somewhere around the 1920s, and moving on to Germany, we are looking at a movement that's beginning somewhere around again the 1890s, and of course America also, just the years before the First World War. So, when we look at the word modern, which as I said, that it suggests a kind of break from what was already there, we introduce another word here, which is the avant-garde. So, the avant-garde is actually a term that comes from the military discourse and is used for it's used as a metaphor for a kind of self-advanced position. But the avant-garde is very central to the modernist movement and is used as a kind of, it reflects an attitude that looks ahead. And of course critics have classified it variously, like the old avant-garde, referring to the French symbolists, or the new avant-garde, which is neo-modernism or theatre of the absurd and so on. But what is important for us here is to understand that the word avant-garde reflects a kind of attitude that allows us to create new ways of thinking, new ways of writing, new patterns of writing. So, both at the level of form and at the level of content, the word modern and the word avant-garde are in a sense very, very symbolic of the new trends in the 20th century. So, for instance, when we look at Arthur Rimbaud, so who says that you have to almost totally reject the artistic precursors who were already there. And in the field of drama, somebody like Antoine Artaud also does the same thing. The idea that you have to now create a system on on stage which is totally different. It is a complete break from what was there in the past. So, which means that there is newness on every front. There is a new language in the making. There is a new way in which art and literature have hitherto been looked at, and all these things then change. So, if we look at just a kind of quick view of the different kinds of isms, so to say, that are there, and each of them, each movement comes with its own manifesto in a sense. So, for instance, when we have symbolism, how this image that already exists there is combined with a kind of concept, and it is used to express both either an emotion or an idea. So, and how poets especially see all this around them and recreate and create anew these ideas in poetry. One of the early kind of movements and with a manifesto of their own is Futurism. So, it comes somewhere emerges around 1909, and Filippo Tommaso Marinetti wrote, and I quote from the manifesto: "The founding and manifesto of Futurism, we must shake the gates of life, test the bolts and hinges." So, which means that we can no longer accept what was already there in the past, and we have to now put them through a critical test, a rigor. And so, in the manifesto he says, we need to sing the love of danger, the habit of energy and fearlessness. Courage, audacity, revolt will be essential elements of our poetry. So, and he says that except in struggle there is no more beauty, and we will destroy the museums, libraries, academies and so on. So, I mean, if we just look at some of the points that are not only there in Futurism, but also in the movements that follow. For instance, energy, a kind of fearlessness, a kind of courage, this desire to put the established writers of the past through a kind of test to see how is it that they are relevant in this new world. And so he says that in fact they all in a sense reject them and say that we need to think and start afresh from a kind of blank slate where none of these pre-existing theories really hold ground. Similar to Futurism, we move on to another one which is called Vorticism, and it starts somewhere in 1912, and they come out with a kind of review and of various texts that are produced under this category. So, they are brought out in what is called Blast by Wyndham Lewis, and this starts in 1914. So they publish the works of the modernists, and Wyndham Lewis says that we stand for the reality of the present, not for a sentimental future or the sacrosanct past. So he says we do not want to make people wear futurist patches. So two things are happening here. One, that there is a complete rejection of what has just happened in the past, and at the same time, for instance, when we see Futurism, it begins around 1909, and when we look at Vorticism, we are looking at 1912 and 14. So in a way, they also kind of distinguish themselves from the new theories that are emerging, in the early 20th century. So he says that we need the consciousness of humanity, their stupidity, animalism, and dreams. So, a kind of blast then, as he says, provides a platform where all sorts of violent ideas are also kind of, they could reach the people who would read all these, journals and magazines. So it becomes a forum, a way of presenting art of the individuals at that time. Close on the heels, we have another movement called Dadaism, and started by Tristram Tzara, and pretty much meaning nothing. And it uses things like the collage effect, where unrelated objects are put together, and great writers like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot were also influenced by Dadaism. And in the 1920s, then this also moved into another movement called Surrealism, where the unconscious mind is connected with the conscious mind, and there are these effects of dreams, hallucinations, and so on. So modernism in this sense, becomes a kind of conglomeration of varied impulses, where there is a complete rejection of the past, and there is this effort to develop a new aesthetic. And here I would request Professor Prakash to also discuss the ideas of modernism with us.
Modernism it poses a problem to me, and that problem is we have been using this word in criticism for a long time, much before modernism might have come into existence as an ism. For instance, modern era, modern phase of writing, modern English literature starts somewhere after the medieval period. So in that sense, Chaucer is the first modern poet. Then comes Shakespeare. All these people also rejected the medieval past, and they came into the modern world. Renaissance is in fact a modern phenomena. So we've been hearing all that, and suddenly in the early 20th century, this word emerges that there is modernism. And the difference between what we considered modern earlier and modernism is that, as you rightly say, rejection of the past. In fact, modernism initially would critique the past, would take some advantage from here and build up a thesis that would help both the understanding of the past and a projection of the present into the future. So what do you say to this?
No, absolutely. When we look at the word modern itself,
yes.
Modern signifies a kind of, there are two ways of looking at it. One could be a break from the past, the other is kind of organically evolving from the past to create new ideas and to respond to that. So what modernism does, and of course, whether we look at the Renaissance period or we look at other, historical arenas of literature, so the word modern is equally applicable there. But what is it that kind of allows us to look at the early 20th century, especially as a modernist period, is precisely this, that there is so much of experimentation that is happening at this time, and it is everything is almost as if there's a literary laboratory everywhere, and people are trying to see how is it that they can rearrange words, how is it they can rearrange ideas.
So literature then has shifted from society, from history, from the tradition of writing, expressing, to what you call the language laboratory.
Yes.
And that people are now thinking not of the world around, but of the words, but of the images, but of the symbols that you say.
Right.
So it's a different kind of modernism, something that rejects the past, which means modern period by itself can survive.
Which also actually leads us to this whole idea that when it becomes a kind of language laboratory, we also, if you relate it to what happens in the 19th century, post these very, very radical thinkers, and especially with this whole theory of evolution of mankind, it disturbs a kind of established system of society, and of course after Nietzsche and Freud and all these things, all these thinkers, one realizes that it is no longer possible to think the way people had thought before, let's say Darwin or Marx or Nietzsche. So in this sense, it seems as if people are immediately taking refuge into this kind of language laboratory where
What
they are
about
experimenting.
what about the world that exists around them? For instance, in today's lecture, already it is announced that there will be a coverage of formalism, socialism, and existentialism. All of them belong to the 20th century. So modernism seems to be totally taking itself away from these. Otherwise, the past will start now concentrating on formalism, which is slightly older, in the sense that there are forms. There are forms in literature, there are forms in society, and that we will be discussing them. So, in fact, modernism, some kind of revenge is taken by formalism and socialism on modernism by telling that by itself modernism cannot exist.
In fact, formalism to begin with is used as a pejorative. It is used as a term, that indicates that, okay, fine, there are these people who are concentrating on form. And the whole idea of this conflict between form and content is something that is raised by the formalists. So, absolutely right. And formalism, of course, in a sense, certainly not socialism, but formalism in a sense actually carries this and reinvents this whole idea about the debate between form and content, and allows us to kind of think differently about things. And this is of course coupled with the whole idea of are the modernist ideas that move on, or are these ideas static in a certain manner?
And one more query. That query is about the series that we are conducting. The series is called World Literature. And world literature of the 20th century would then mean, that there are many other trends also. So,
Yes.
modernism is not all sweeping.
Yes.
Modernism is not all covering. There is much that is left outside from it.
Yes, the only except for the fact that when we look at so many of these, the manifestos that emerge, for instance, we are talking about Futurism, so we are talking about Marinetti. When we talk about Vorticism, it's Wyndham Lewis, all from different places. Dadaism emerges from Zurich, so Tristan Tzara, and of course there are a whole lot of artists and painters like Paul Eluard, there's Picasso, and then Salvador Dali, who actually look at Surrealism. So it is, in a sense, it becomes a trend. This idea of experimentation, this idea, I think modernism can only be valued for the fact that it allows us, it gives us that space to think that there is another way of looking at things. However, the problem that emerges is that all these ideas in talking about not the objective reality, but a kind of subjective reality that is going on in one's mind, because the modernists strongly believe that the outer reality is fine, is there, is objective, palpable, but there is an equally palpable reality which is in
And imagine
the mind.
Imagine the interesting part. In the first 20 years of the 20th century, you have modernism breaking completely from the past.
Yes.
And you have socialism,
Yes.
which is there, which is building up, and in 1970 it will emerge as some kind of a shocking event, for these people.
Absolutely.
So, I think when you explain formalism and socialism, some kind of critique would itself emerge of modernism.
Yes.
Maybe you can start with that.
So, moving on, when we talk about a kind of development of a new sort of aesthetic and so on, this is where I think formalism particularly becomes very important, and it emerges again in the 1920s. So, we have what is called the Opojaz, the Society for the Study of Poetic Language, that emerges in 1916, and it is formed by teachers and students who are associated with language studies. Victor Shklovsky and Boris Eichenbaum and Roman Jakobson is very, very important here. So, by 1923, these people merge with what is called the Moscow Linguistic Circle. So, if we look at some of the factors that emerge here, and as Professor Prakash rightly pointed out, that a critique directly emerges, because where there is so much of emphasis in modernist writing on a kind of fragmentation, what the individual experiences in a sense can be translated on the words onto the words on the page. So we realize that a scientific outlook towards the study of literature is something that emerges with formalism. The idea that form is important. And what is the index? The question that the formalists raise in a sense is that what is really speaking the index for determining the literariness of a text? Is it the emotions? Is it the subjective element? Or is it something else? And this is where the formalists pay a lot of attention to the idea of form. So the distinction between form and content, in a sense, has not been there. In fact, if you look at it, prior to formalism, the stress had been on emotions at times, what is the writer's life all about and so on. But the formalists reject all this, and in opting for a kind of rational, scientific perspective, the writer too is in that sense not as important, and which indicates the end of the very, very old style conventional biographical approach. So and the word that is a kind of theory that emerges, which is extremely valuable for us today also, is defamiliarization, the idea of making strange. So here I will just explain the term defamiliarization. So it is quote unquote to make the already familiar seem strange, awakening a heightened sense of perception, which means that unlike the modernist strain that relies completely on individual subjectivity and allows for a kind of valuing in emotion, a kind of a break, the idea that meaning can no longer be conveyed because meaning itself is fragmented, is broken up into these many parts. We have formalism that talks about a heightened sense of perception, which means that a distance is created between the text that one is creating and one is reading and the way it is being read, being interpreted. So to quote Victor Shklovsky, and from his essay Art as Technique, he writes, the technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. And we have to ask here, what is the ultimate aim of this process of prolonging, of enjoying? And prolonging it here means not a kind of fragmentation, but to also appreciate art. So and this is where I think this idea of the heightened sense of perception, of being able to actually objectively look at a text, is something that emerges with formalism. And of course, it gives us a totally new cue. And one must say that, the early 20th century is generally, understood only in terms of these many manifestos and the different experiments that emerge. But another trend that coexists and that, requires equal understanding and weightage is that of formalism, which of course, and formalism and socialism then need to be kind of studied together. So just to give a very quick example of what the formalists did, for instance, they come up with these two terms. For instance, there is a fabula, which would be a kind of chronological sequence, and there's a Suzette, which would be a plot in a narrative. So which means that a plot in a narrative, the sequence can change, and there is something which is a kind of chronological sequence. Now if we look at it, and we even and to my mind at least, when we make a complete leap into something like magic realism, and we look at the way Marquez kind of looks at the text and so on, we can see the germ of that idea is already there in the early 20th century. So where this idea of experimenting with a sequence of events and to recreate that sequence of events is already being suggested by formalism. So if we, another closely allied idea to this is that of the motive. What are the kind of motives, or what is the kind of, in a sense, the motivation behind a text. So which also gives a sense of, unlike modernism and the whole idea of fragmentation and the individual feeling lonely and lost, the idea of a kind of motivation that is there to a work, a sense of direction that is being given. So what is absolutely essential to, let's say, a text, and what is it that can be dispensed with? And it's interesting, Professor Prakash, as Shklovsky says that Tristram Shandy was a work, without any motivation whatsoever. And the kind of stress that the formalists lay on poetry particularly is very, very important, because they feel that poetics deals with verbal structures, like painting deals with the pictorial ones. So linguistics is the domain of the verbal structures, and poetics is then central to it.
In a way, Dr. Nagpal, you have already created ground for socialism and the last one, existentialism, by bringing in formalism. So formalism is explained as something which talks about language, which talks about experimentation, which talks about defamiliarization, as you call it, making something which is natural strange, and that's how one is entering a new area. And I think that is the purpose of connecting and disconnecting these particular trends of thought. And viewers, with this particular point of formalism coming up as a critique of the modernist writing, we enter the next domain of theory in the 20th century, and for that we will take up the discussion further into the second half of our discussion. Thank you. Welcome viewers back to the second part of the discussion, and here we will be covering apart from formalism, which has been introduced, socialism and existentialism, and ultimately I hope the discussion will go in the direction of unifying all the 4 or 5 units of theory into a kind of working whole with which we understand literature. So now I once again request Dr. Nagpal to continue with the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. We already discussed formalism. We've discussed before that modernism. So when we move from modernism to formalism, we see a kind of where the modernist movement becomes a kind of blanket term for all sorts of experiment that's happening, which is happening primarily at a very individualistic and aesthetic level. When we move on to formalism, we see that it is in that sense a movement that gives a different direction to literary trends. And both of course are running around the same time, but it ties up very well with the kind of movement that takes place in the early 20th century. I mean, if you look at the context of Russia, of course 1905 onwards, to 1917 and the Russian Revolution and so on. So, what really speaking is socialism, and what are the basic aspects of socialism that are materialized in the early 20th century. So, if we look at again, these are ideas that emerge in the 19th century. So, there's the overnight socialism of that period. There's Louis Blanc in France, and with the stress on cooperatives and so on. And with Marx and Engels in going back to their writings and going back to the famous manifesto to of the Communist Party. So, this whole idea of private property and profit motive is questioned. So, when we look at the 20th century, we see that there is a struggle to actually realize equality at all levels, to abolish this idea of any kind of individual profit making that happens, and to abolish the sense of private property, that the individual owns things. So, things do belong to the community, as a sense, things belong to the world at large. So, when we talk about world literature, in a sense, this idea of an equal distribution of things, of resources, becomes extremely important for us to have an organic idea of that can be realized, where there can be a sense of equality that prevails, and a sense of not only just in terms of distribution of resources, but also a sense of equal participation that emerges in the 20th century with Russia. So, of course, Russia at that time becomes a standing example of the realization of these ideas. How it was, of course, ruled under the rule of a Tsar Nicholas II, and from there how the workers went on strike, and there was a revolution in 1905 where, because of prices, rise in prices and decline in wages. So, from the Puchelov of iron works, workers were dismissed and there was a call for strike. So, following which, at least some semblance of a kind of parliament, or the Duma as it was called, emerged in Russia. Of course, it was totally shelved, and it was reconstituted 3 times. So, from there to the revolution in the month of February, known as the famous February Revolution, and of course leading to the very famous revolution in Russia in 1917, that totally changed the way the world looked at these ideas, and in that sense Russia became a standing example of the possibility and realization of these ideas. And I would request Professor Prakash, especially because he also specializes in this area, if you could share your views on this.
No, you have rightly pointed out the rising crisis in the capitalist world, and that is referred to as something that is connected with production, with inequality in society, with rising level of poverty on the one side and riches on the other. And when there is a great stress by the authors, some of the authors, on exploitation, as the word is used. Socialism was built in capitalism, in fact.
Yes.
And I would say, I don't know whether you would agree or not, I would think that the crisis-ridden capitalism, becoming aware of its problems, that is the basis of socialism. Right. That's why Karl Marx perhaps named his most famous work not anything socialist economy, but Capital.
Right.
So he was studying the capital. So studying the capital is a basis for socialism. So as a theory, this can be used in the early 20th century. And secondly, imagine that crisis of capital is happening somewhere in Europe or in America, but the socialism starts knocking at the door of the world at the point of Russia.
Yes.
Which is a backward economy, backward country. It's a country visited by medievalism, in spite of certain authors coming up and critiquing it. So socialism is something that is connected with life, that is connected with relevance of history, and that which is a negation of modernism as well as formalism, because form alone without reference to the content which it carries it doesn't work. Formalism gives a different definition. It totally rejects content, and in fact content is also a kind of form for them. So that's the wrong emphasis, and I believe that imagine that when we are discussing socialism, we are discussing in the context of the world, and world literature in fact will become possible in our own mind only because the world finally has entered that phase where one is connected with another, which is once again socialism. We are not talking of India, we are not talking of Europe, we are not talking of any specific country, we are talking of society. And society, brings together that element which finally will bring humanity together. So that is the socialist understanding, and both of us have in mind what is written in England and in Europe, but we are not talking about what is also written in India, in Japan, in certain parts of America, in Africa. There also literature was being created. Was it modernist, was it formalistic, or was it political? So in fact the word political is totally banned from discussions of literature, but socialism brings back this word, and you would find that in the 20th century most of the important writing has been done by people who carry the epithet, carry the name socialism. They are socialist writers. Gorky, Brecht, these are socialist writers. Premchand in India is more or less a socialist writer. Faiz Ahmad Faiz is there, and this is what is constituting world literature. So I would in fact request you to talk about the certain texts which tell us that humanity and society are interconnected. That is what socialism is.
Yes. So just to add to what you just said, that when we look at the context of Russia, we are looking at a country which is backward at that time, because 85% of it belongs in a sense to, it is agrarian, it belongs to the peasantry, and you do not have the workers the way you do elsewhere. So you have the industrial towns are primarily Moscow and St. Petersburg. So that and the kind of, but yet at the same time there's huge disparity there, because when we look at it, if you look at it in terms of just the river Neva that's there. So on the one side you have people who are extremely prosperous, and you have the palaces and so on, and on the other side you have the world of the workers and the soldiers who are residing there. So it creates this kind of unrest and dissatisfaction, which materializes into I think such a glorious period in history, where this idea of equality is realized, and as Professor Prakash rightly pointed out, that this is not something that is specific to Russia, but capitalism as a whole is happening across countries, and that is where the kind of crisis that emerges. For instance, the kind of, what is extremely famous and we all know is the economic crash in America that happens in 1929, and how that creates a discontent of a certain kind. So when we talk of socialism, as is rightly pointed out, it emerges from this kind of crisis of capitalism. And of course in the 19th century, thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels have discussed this, and writers in France, writers in Russia have discussed these ideas, and they are also writers who have had access to other literatures. They are writers who've traveled to other countries. If you look at the context of Russia post the abolition of slavery, so in the 19th century, I'm not even talking about the 20th century, but in the 19th century, we have a writer like Turgenev who did travel to Paris, and he was in France at the time of the revolution of 1848. So it becomes interesting to see how these ideas, the seed of these ideas is already there, and how it emerges in a certain kind of manner. Close to this is another very important point that we must keep in mind, that that Professor Prakash just raised, that when we talk about modernism, it's happening, it's almost as if it's happening across the globe. So we need to understand that this is happening only in certain parts, and then for instance we have formalism that's happening, socialist ideas that have emerged. Now here I'd just like to bring in a very important socialist thinker, Lukacs, who says that when he talks about the kind of techniques that are floated by modernism on the one hand, and let's say formalism on the other, he says the distinctions that concern us are not those between stylistic techniques in the formalist sense. It is the view of the world, the ideology or Weltanschauung underlying a writer's work that counts, and it is the writer's attempt to reproduce this view of the world which constitutes his intention and is the formative principle underlying the style of a given piece of writing. So, he talks about different potentialities, and he totally rejects this idea of the abstract potentiality, saying that, you know, it is something that seems like, you know, these are ideas of stasis, these are static ideas where the individual almost has no connect with the society that he is living in. So, and you know, he says that, you know, art and literature of this kind in that sense is not going to really be leading. So, he says that, you know, the ontology of man itself in modernist literature invalidates the kind of dialectic that is there between the individual and the reality, the objective reality of which the individual is a part. But I would like to go back to you know, the quote from Lukacs' The Ideology of Modernism, where he says that it is the view of the world, and for us it is very important because when we study a course on world literature, the whole idea of the Weltanschauung, it becomes important to look at it from this perspective, that what is the role of the writer when we talk about world literature? What is the role of the reader who is responding to these texts? So, it is the view of the world, the ideology that underlies the work that counts.
May I ask this question? In this context, I am raising the question, what is the ideology of, let us say, modernism? What is the ideology of formalism? Because they have also an ideology,
so
and that should, you know, help us understand their position vis-a-vis the world.
Right. So, when we talk about the ideology of modernism, so, and this is one of the points that Lukacs makes, that, you know, this whole emphasis on a kind of abstraction, the whole emphasis on fragmentation, the whole emphasis on the fact that the individual is totally lonely, is not able to connect or even react at times to his immediate objective reality, because the reality that in a sense modernism has not simply brought in but also privileged is the interiority. So, there is, you know, I mean, Lukacs rejects that, and he says that this is the kind of ideology in a sense that does not allow you to move anywhere. It leads to circularity.
It is all individual centered, it is circular. It does not take us anywhere. And in that famous essay that you are quoting and that you have in mind is ideology of modernism. So, he is able to go into this question from the socialist angle.
Yes.
So, anybody who says something must have an ideology behind it. And if these people are saying that they are talking about the individual, talking about this and that which is disparate, unconnected, then they are also extending the ideology of some section in society. That section may be the capitalist section. What do you say?
No, I totally agree with you here that it is important for the writer. I mean, when we use the term world literature, for instance, what is it that the writer is you know, talking about? So, if there is no ideology, if these are only going to be personal musings about, you know, dissociating from the world and, you know, moving into, let's say, 24 hours in a person's life, or let's say 1 hour in a person's life, if that is what it is going to be, then it is going to be totally literature. And if we say that, you know, raise the question about what is the function of literature, then literature is going to be totally dissociated from the world in which it is produced. So, that is a very, very problematic idea, and Lukacs, I mean, absolutely correctly totally counters all this and says that, you know, the kind of potentiality that we should actually look for in literature is where there is an organic relationship between the writer and the world that he represents.
So, the writer has to get back to the world in order to become a socialist, in order to be aware of his role, and he should be critiquing very sharply and rightly the trends that take the writer away from the social reality.
Right. And here, in fact, you know, I mean, I think if you could comment a little bit about Balzac, because Balzac, whatever be his sympathies when he writes the realist novel in the making, he is able to give an objective description of the way the structures around him are changing, and this is way back early 19th century.
Balzac's perspective is absolutely mind-boggling, in the sense, you know, that this person says that he does not write his own opinions. To quote that famous thing from Balzac, he says, I am only an assistant to history. So, I am saying what history dictates me. So, I am a kind of a note taker. If this is what the writer says, then he totally takes away his individuality and talks about society only. And Balzac is saying this when, as you rightly say, his associations in life are in fact pro the old world, ancient regime. But when he comes to writing, then he is talking about history. And history means the past, history means the presence of history into the present. And these people are totally rejecting any connection with history, any connection with the past, and they want to just wallow in their own loneliness. So, in fact, socialist theory can be understood best by critiquing these trends and establishing that there has to be an organic link between the writer and the society which produced him or her. So, this is what socialism is in the 20th century. And this is a kind of, and this appeals to citizens all over the world. In fact, we are, according to socialism, citizens of the world, not of this and that country. So, our specificities will remain, but our final overall kind of projection would be towards humanity. Yes.
So, in fact, Lukacs correctly says that you can't simply isolate formal criteria from content, and the content is equally important. And here another very important point that I think we need to keep in mind is about the fact that when we talk about other countries, and we can straight away here take the example of India, that the kind of writing that is being produced in the early 20th century, where people in India fighting the colonial powers, that kind of writing is very different from this kind of fragmented writing that we are talking about, in which we call the modernist writing. So, at the same time, in the early 20th century, if we look at theatre, and if we look at the world of drama, then a lot of experimentation is happening there too. And there too, we might have writers who totally reject the past and try to evolve absolutely new strains of thought that might or might not be possible on stage. But we have a playwright like Bertolt Brecht, who has actually been able to evolve a complete system called that of the epic theatre, which totally counters these ideas and is able to give a kind of direction, a sense of direction, a sense of meaning, where he is able to talk about the needs, the requirements of people at large, and not restrict them to the interests of a few.
Dr. Nagpal, you talked about, you used an expression called ontology of being. What is that? Can you explain a bit?
The idea that the human being, in a sense, is somebody that needs to be looked at as somebody who's constantly evolving. The human being cannot be somebody static. So, when we look at the human being from an ontological perspective, then the entity is something that cannot be restricted to a trap of stasis, which is what modernism does, and it seems as if one
what
cannot.
What is being?
Of the individual entity, and this is where actually when we look at the term being, for us existentialism becomes an important point of entry, a philosophical theory that has huge implications also in terms of how the individual operates. For instance, when we talk about existentialism, and there are a lot of proponents of what is called the theory of existentialism.
Is being threatened by the modern world?
The being is constantly threatened by the modern world.
In the sense, that what you are, or what I am, what I am supposed to be, all this is stopped from happening because the pressures are coming from outside.
Actually, there are more ways than one of probably understanding this, because if you look at the being from within the modernist structure, then the being is simply threatened by change.
Yes.
Then the being is threatened by change, and that would really be a very regressive position. But when we look at the being from other more constructive theories, such as that of, for instance, socialism, and to a certain extent if you look at existentialism also, then the being is somebody who is going to be responsible, in a sense, for his or her own acts, is somebody who is going to be with the society at large.
Please say something more about it. It's very interesting.
Yes. So, so when we talk about existentialism here, I mean, before moving on to existentialism, but the idea is that the being here is going to be threatened by a kind of economic disparity. Within these more constructive theories, the being is not going to be in a trap or in a structure of stasis, but is going to be threatened by a kind of the disparities created in a capitalist system, and it would be up to the being to then take responsibility and to move ahead. Whereas, of course, socialism does it in an extremely constructive manner. We also have a theory that emerges, very in a different direction, that is called existentialism. So, I mean, the early proponents, of course, posited faith in religion and said that, like Karl Jaspers, and said that you need to take that leap of faith. But in a post-Nietzschean world, that leap of faith is not possible in that sense. So, how is it that the individual then operates? And this is where Jean-Paul Sartre comes up with the idea of existence, the idea that existence precedes essence, and that man, in a sense, the human being is born in a kind of mire, and he has the choice of coming out of it. So existentialism, in talking about the being, so to say, as an entity, in talking about the idea of existence, is drawing attention to a kind of materiality that exists in society. The fact that we are a part of the society and we work in a certain way. And of course, existentialism sees as all these structures as absolutely inimical to the development of the I. That is, which is why Sartre says that it's almost as if it's the human being is born in a kind of muck, so to say. So, but existentialism leads to a heightened awareness of self, and of course points out towards the absurdity of existence.
Is existence social existence?
If we again in the context of the 20th century, if I have to answer this, then if we are looking at the movement that we are looking at will also determine the answer. Again, for modernism, the individual has stopped interacting with society. It is only socialist thought that allows us to look at a very constructive engagement of the individual with society.
Socialism reconnects individual with society. Okay.
Existentialism only goes half the way, because there's this the emphasis is on the development of the being, and the being in that sense remains the individual. It is only with socialism that the full interaction of the individual with his or her immediate world is something that
you also use the word materiality. What does it signify?
In the context that, of course, a term that really does not emerge in a sense from existentialism, but is a term that emerges again, as part of socialist thought and essential to it. But in talking about existentialism, is just trying to draw attention to the fact that even with existentialism, the individual's interaction with the palpably felt structures of society is there. Whether they are whether seen as positive or not is another point. But the fact that the individual is a part of the society is something that is brought forth. So how is it that the individual then interacts with these structures is something that existentialism raises. So when I use the word materiality, it was also to kind of explain how even with philosophical thought like existentialism, one is no longer talking about another world. One is talking about this very world, and the responsibility of this very world is on the individual and the decision that he takes, which means that there is a certain power that is now being vested in the individual, and he or she is being made responsible for his or her actions. And the fact that
action succeeds finally, what happens?
I would say that then we have to link it and say that it certainly moves towards socialist thought, and there is going to be a kind of constructive engagement with society.
Can we call that essence?
The essence that within the structure of existentialism,
if you are happy, you have taken a decision and you have fulfilled expectations made by the decision, so that gives you happiness.
That reflects on the essence.
Is that essence?
Yes. So the existence, the sheer fact of the being, the sheer fact that you exist is something that is the first point, and it precedes this manifestation which creates the essence.
So through materiality, you understand life, you connect it with socialist theory, you take decisions. Decisions are not your own, not your individual decisions, but they are decisions that are relevant to society, and then some kind of a fulfillment occurs. Re-establishment of classlessness, let's call it. Would that be essence?
Within existentialist thought, that is considered to be the essence. For instance, in fact, Sartre goes ahead and says that man is responsible for himself, but he is not responsible for his own individuality alone. He is also responsible for all other men. So which means that the individual, when he performs certain actions or takes a certain decision, the constructive decision is something that is going to impact the rest of humanity also. And an interesting phrase again by Sartre is that man is condemned to be free. So this whole idea is that when he says very specifically that I use the word condemn, because he says he did not create himself. So there's there is creation, but the fact is that now he is totally free and he has to exercise choice. This idea of exercising choice, this idea of the material existence of the being, I think these are two very valuable inputs that existentialism, in the realm of philosophy, that existentialism gives us.
So which means existentialism then starts contributing to an awareness of the need of socialism.
Yes, because I mean, if we move on, if we actually for the moment just look at these two movements, from modernism, when we move on to existentialism, we realize that unlike modernism, where there is stasis and the individual is it's only circularity that is being talked about, but here through the element of choice, human being commits himself or herself to action. And of course, which is why when we talk about second wave feminism and we talk about Simone de Beauvoir, it's the whole structure of Sartre's ideas that has actually given us that possibility.
Friends, we reached the end of the discussion by this time. We have covered modernism, formalism, socialism and existentialism, and we have seen them in their interconnection, so that finally they tell us about the unity of literature as world literature today. And the discussion has given enough insights for us to mull over, and let's hope that this discussion continues among you, and we will have other lectures to give. And till then, goodbye, and thanks, Dr. Barna.
Thank you.